Today we are going to explain the gait cycle. There are 7 major events that happen during the gait cycle. These events will help define the different phases of the gait cycle. So let's review these events first. First, we'll have initial contact of the foot that we're focusing on today, which is the leg in red. The next major event is opposite toe off. The next event is heel rise. The next event is opposite initial contact. Next, we have toe off. Next, we have feet adjacent. And finally, we have tibia vertical. So these major events that we just illustrated with the red leg will help define the different phases. There are 2 main phases. There's a stance phase and a swing phase. The stance phase will take up about the first 2/3 of the cycle, while the swing phase will take up the last third of the cycle. So to begin, between initial contact and opposite toe off, we have a phase called loading response. Between opposite toe off and heel rise is known as mid stance. Between heel rise and opposite initial contact is known as terminal stance. Between opposite initial contact and toe off is known as pre-swing. These events written here is part of the stance phase. Now back to our diagram. Between toe off and feet adjacent is known as initial swing. Between feet adjacent and tibia vertical is known as mid swing. And finally, between tibia vertical and going all the way back to the start of the gait cycle, which has the same elements of initial contact, this is known as terminal swing. These elements grouped together is known as the swing phase. So here you have, simply put, the main elements of the gait cycle. So the first event in the gait cycle is initial contact. This takes up 0% to 2% of the gait cycle phase. So looking at the hip first, we're going to see that the hip will be in about 20 to 30 degrees of hip flexion. And we'll see that the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings, so the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings will be firing. At the knee, it will be at about 0 degrees full extension. And once again, the hamstrings will be firing to help the knee stabilize the knee joint. And here at the ankle, it will be at about 0 degrees neutral. And the tibia will be slightly externally rotated, which means that the foot will be slightly supinated. Those will always be paired together. Whenever the tibia is externally rotated, the foot will be supinated. And the muscle being activated here is tibialis anterior to help slow down that deceleration of the foot about to go into the next phase, which is loading response. Now we are going to look at a live model. So here in this freeze frame for initial contact, you see the hip is in 20 to 30 degrees of flexion. The gluteus maximus and the hammies are concentrically activated. The knee is in full extension and the hamstrings are eccentrically activated. And at the ankle is at 0 degrees neutral with the tibialis anterior activated. The first phase of the gait cycle is loading response. This begins with initial contact and ends with the opposite toe off. And this takes about 2% to 10% of the gait cycle phase. This is a period where there is double limb support because each limb is in contact with the ground. So let's talk about loading response at the hip. At the hip, it was starting about at 30 degrees of flexion, and it is moving into 20 degrees of flexion. And then the muscles activated during this are adductor magnus, gluteus maximus, and the hamstrings. So we've got the hamstrings, glute max, and adductor magnus, which is on the medial side. The knee will start at 0 degrees at initial contact, and through the loading response, it will flex to about 15 degrees. And the muscles activated to help the knee are the quadriceps. Now I bet you're wondering, why the quadriceps? I thought the quads help with knee extension. Well, they do, but when you're weight bearing, there's so much gravity and weight bearing on the knee joint that the quadriceps are working eccentrically to straighten the leg to keep it from collapsing. So the quadriceps are active to help stabilize the knee. For the ankle, it is going into about 5 to 10 degrees of plantar flexion. And the tibia is starting to internally rotate, which means that the foot is starting to pronate. And the muscle activated for the ankle is the tibialis anterior. It is working eccentrically to slowly lower the foot onto the ground. Now watch the hip starting from 30 degrees of flexion going to about 20 degrees of flexion, and the adductor magnus, gluteus maximus, and hamstrings activated. Now watch the knee going from full extension into 15 degrees of flexion with the quadriceps. Watch the ankle go into 5 to 10 degrees of plantar flexion by the tibialis anterior. The next significant phase of the gait cycle is opposite toe off. This occurs at the 10% mark of the gait cycle. It is the end of the loading response and the beginning of mid-stance. So we'll look at opposite toe off at the hip. Hip was in 20 degrees of flexion, and it's starting to move into extension. The same muscles of gluteus maximus and the hamstrings are still firing. At the knee, it was in 15 degrees of flexion, moving more into flexion, and the quadriceps are still firing. At the ankle is moving into dorsiflexion. The tibia is still internally rotating, which means the foot is pronating. And now the triceps surae, which is the gastroc, soleus, plantaris, all those muscles back here in your calf, are now firing. At the moment of opposite toe off, the hip is in 20 degrees of flexion and continuing to extend. The gluteus maximus and hamstrings are helping with that. The knee is continuing to flex with the quadriceps. And the ankle is moving into dorsiflexion with the triceps surae activated. The second phase of the gait cycle is mid-stance. Mid-stance occurs from 10% to 30% of the gait cycle. It begins at opposite toe off and ends at heel rise. The picture here is pictured at 18% of the gait cycle. So let's look at the hip. The hip was starting at 20 degrees of flexion at opposite toe off and is moving into 10 degrees of extension. So we'll just draw an arrow there showing that the hip is moving into extension. The gluteus maximus and the hamstrings have ceased firing, and now the gluteus medius and the TFL, the tensor fasciae latae, are now active to help stabilize the lateral sag of the hip. At the knee, it was in 15 degrees of flexion, moving more into extension, and the quads are firing to help stabilize that knee. At the ankle, it is moving into dorsiflexion, and with the knee going back into extension, the tibia is starting to externally rotate, which means the foot is now moving into supination. And the triceps surae, muscles in your calf, are firing to help with this action. Look at the hip. It continues into 10 degrees of extension with the gluteus medius and tensor fasciae latae. At the knee, it reaches 15 degrees of flexion and then goes into extension with the quadriceps. At the ankle, it is changing from plantar flexion to dorsiflexion with the triceps surae. The next event of the gait cycle is heel rise. This occurs at the 30% mark of the gait cycle phase, and it's the transition from mid stance into terminal stance. So the picture here is at about 32% of the gait cycle, and we'll look at the hip. The hip will be continuing to go into extension to about 10 degrees of extension, and the glute med and the TFL are continuing to help prevent that pelvic sag. At the knee, we have reached 0 degrees of extension, and the gastrocs are firing to keep the knee stable. At the ankle, we are in 10 degrees of dorsiflexion, with the tibias externally rotating, the foot is supinating, and our triceps surae are also continuing their activity. In this freeze frame of heel rise, the hip continues into 10 degrees of extension with the gluteus medius and tensor fasciae latae. The knee is at 0 degrees extension with the gastroc activated, and the ankle is at 10 degrees of dorsiflexion with the triceps surae. The next event of the gait cycle is opposite initial contact. It is the mark of the halfway point of the gait cycle. It is the end of terminal stance and the beginning of pre-swing. So let's look at the hip. The hip is going to reach its maximum extension of the gait cycle from about 10 to 20 degrees of hip extension. And the adductor longus is starting to fire to bring the hip towards flexion. Adductor longus being on the medial side. The knee was at 0 degrees and it is now moving into slight flexion, about 5 degrees, and the quads are firing to help stabilize the knee. At the ankle is moving into plantar flexion, with the tibia externally rotating, the foot at maximum supination during the gait cycle, and the triceps surae are concentrically contracting. With this freeze frame of opposite initial contact, the hip reaches its maximum hip extension for the gait cycle for 10 degrees to 20 degrees, and the adductor longus is going to be the primary hip flexor to start bringing it into flexion. The knee is already moving into slight flexion of 5 degrees with the quadriceps working eccentrically, and the ankle is moving into plantar flexion with the concentric triceps surae. The next event of the gait cycle is toe off. It is the end of stance phase and the beginning of swing phase. And this occurs at 60% of the gait cycle period. So let's look at the hip. The hip, as we remember from last event, was in max extension and is continuing into flexion. And the adductor longus and the quadriceps are helping with the hip flexion. The knee is now in 20 degrees of flexion, and the quadriceps are also helping with that knee stabilization. At the ankle went through push off and is in maximum plantar flexion of the gait cycle, and the MTP, the metatarsophalangeal joint, was at 55 degrees of dorsiflexion there, and the tibialis anterior is now starting to activate to bring that plantar flexion into dorsiflexion so that your toe does not drag during the next phase. Here at toe off, the hip is coming out of maximum extension and continuing into flexion with the quadriceps and adductor longus. The knee is supposed to be at 20 degrees of flexion
but pictured here, my knee is in 70 degrees of flexion, and it is activated by the quadriceps. At the ankle, it reaches peak plantar flexion of the gait cycle, and the metatarsophalangeal joint is at 55 degrees of dorsiflexion, and this is activated by the tibialis anterior.
The next event of the gait cycle is feet adjacent. This occurs at about 77% of the gait cycle, and it is the end of the initial swing phase and beginning of the mid-swing phase. And this picture represents the gait cycle at 77%. So let's look at the hip first. The hip now has moved from max extension and now is in 20 degrees of flexion. And the iliopsoas is the prime hip flexor to move the hip into this position. The knee is at its max flexion during the gait cycle at about 60 to 70% of flexion. But there are no muscles activated at this time to put the knee into flexion. This is all momentum, gravity-driven movement. The ankle is moving in dorsiflexion towards neutral, and the tibia is externally rotating, which means the foot is supinating, and the tibialis anterior is helping with that dorsiflexion movement to get the foot to a neutral position.
When the feet are adjacent, the hip is in 20 degrees of flexion. Muscle activated is iliopsoas. At the knee, it is flexion at 60 to 70 degrees, and there's no muscle activity. The ankle is in dorsiflexion moving towards neutral, and the muscle activated is tibialis anterior.
Tibia vertical occurs at 86% of the gait cycle. It is the end of mid-swing and the beginning of terminal swing. So let's look at the hip, which is now in 30 degrees of flexion. And the hamstrings are firing eccentrically to slow down and decelerate the leg that is swinging forward. The knee was moving from that flexion during the last event towards extension, and the hamstrings too are also activated to help the knee. Now the ankle is in slight dorsiflexion, with the tibialis anterior helping with the dorsiflexion action so that the foot will not drag on the ground and preparing for the next event.
With the tibia vertical, look at the hip. The hip is flexed 30 degrees with eccentric hamstrings. The knee is moving from flexion towards extension, also with eccentric hamstrings. The ankle is in slight dorsiflexion by the tibialis anterior.
Now the gait cycle has come full circle to end in terminal foot contact. We're at 100% of the gait cycle, we're finished, and terminal foot contact is the red leg that we've been following all this time is now touching the ground. You might recognize this from the beginning of the gait cycle because it's in the exact position of initial foot contact. So with that, we have 30 degrees of hip flexion, and the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings are working eccentrically to slow down or to decelerate the swinging leg. The knee is at 0 degrees of extension, and the hamstrings are also helping to stabilize the knee. At the ankle, it is at 0 degrees or neutral for that heel strike. The tibia is externally rotating, which means the foot is supinating, and the tibialis anterior is keeping that foot in that dorsiflex or neutral position before we start our second gait cycle and do the loading response.
At terminal foot contact, you will see the hip at 30 degrees of flexion with the gluteus maximus and hammies activated. The knee is at about full extension, 0 degrees, with the hamstrings activated. The ankle will be neutral with the tibialis anterior activated. And there you have it, one full gait cycle. We will end with the gait cycle uninterrupted in a split screen from the medial perspective and a posterior perspective. So you can stop and pause the video to examine the muscles and different joints, at different parts of the gait cycle.